Welcome to another episode of Million Dollar Stories, where we get to interview authors all over the world. And today I got a special one here. This does fall in line with a lot of the books that we put out, helping people become free in every which way, especially financially. The book that we're talking about is called Black Liberation Through the Marketplace: Hope, Heartbreak, and the Promise of America. And I have co-authors. It's Rachel Ferguson and Marcus Witcher. Thank you guys so much for being here. If you guys can tell us a little bit about the genesis of the book. Why did you guys write this?
Yeah, well, the Marcus and I are both classical liberal scholars, which, or if you know the word libertarian, classical liberalism is sort of the grandfather
Of course.
philosophy.
Yes. Not many people
Libertarian.
know that, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. No, it doesn't. Liberal doesn't mean left wing in this particular context, but it just means free, right? Free society. Liber meaning free. And so Marcus and I were very aware of actually an incredible collection of insights and scholarship from classical liberals historically and now on race and discrimination. But the truth is that people don't think of us when they think of caring about our history of racial discrimination. They think about the left. And so we wanted to put it all together in one place and say, actually, there's a whole other way of looking at this. And it's both sensitive to the experiences of oppression that people have had, but it's far more hopeful and more hopeful for the American project and our future together, whether we're white, black, or anything else, and for flourishing in that tradition. And so we think it's actually a really great and important third way to offer people.
Yeah, we really wanted to emphasize the fact that we can recognize past injustice, we can acknowledge past injustice without jettisoning our liberal values, the belief in life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, property, right? We argue in the book that our problem really lies in not living up to our liberal values, those Enlightenment liberal values that undergirded the Bill of Rights, that undergirded the Declaration, and of course, the later the Constitution.
So I believe it all begins with, if you've listened to any of my episodes, I do blame a lot of the problems on the education system. So I think it all begins with what you're being told at a very young age. And yes, you could say the parents, but the parents are sending their kids to school for them to learn the right stuff. And if they're not reading the right books and they're given the wrong information, they're going to play by a whole different set of rules as compared to somebody who, let's just say, is given a rich dad, poor dad, or a belief that they hold their legacy in their hands. They are the author of their own story. So where does it all begin? So if individuals are out there and they're struggling, does it all begin with the home or the education system, or maybe just society in general? What do you say?
Yeah, so that's a huge question. I think that it does begin, personally, I think it begins in the home. I think it begins with family, but I think education is really important as well. The most important indicator of student success is parental involvement. I mean, regardless of what type of educational system you have, if you don't have parental involvement, you're going to have worse outcomes, right, than you otherwise would. The book, though, if we're looking at sort of Black Americans, and sort of like, the book tells a really hopeful and amazing story of the way in which Black Americans, in many instances, lifted themselves up out of poverty in the 1870s, the 1880s, 1890s. And Black Americans definitely believe that education was the key, right? Education was the key to the next generation after emancipation, being able to compete in the market economy, but also to be able to provide a better future, right, for their children and their children's children. And one of the things that we detail in the book is the amazing institutions that Black Americans built, whether it be, the Black church, the Black educational system, and without any government funding, or virtually no government funding, right, from 1877 to 1900 or so, Black Americans significantly decreased illiteracy.
Wow.
Rachel, do you have the exact stats on that? It's one of the amazing successes of all time.
Emancipation in 1930, you've got basically you're going from 0 to 80% literacy, which the economist Robert Higgs says might be the greatest leap forward in literacy in the history of the world thus far. And that's built up through, like Marcus was saying, the emphasis on education in the community, but all the social capital that they built through the churches, through the National Negro Business League, through the fraternal associations, through the Sunday schools. It was such an amazing community of people. And social capital is so important to understanding how you build financial capital. You cannot have one without the other in the vast majority of cases. And that's what Black Americans leveraged for themselves. It was extremely powerful.
So does it all take a bad turn come the 60s and 70s? Does it go up? Because I would assume that maybe there's this is lost history. It sounds like not many people realize this. So something happens in the middle of the 1900s that changes everything. And I'm a big believer that capitalism is the way to freedom, right? When you have control of your finances and your health and your ability to just solve problems and be resourceful and add value to the marketplace, that is the answer. But somewhere along the line, I believe this, what you're talking about, this dependency or reliance or belief in government started to change some things. So where does it go wrong?
Yeah, so one thing that I always emphasize with people is that, you know, between 1948 and 1966, the Black poverty rate dropped from an overwhelming majority, something like 87%, to less than half. It was like 41%. I mean, that quick. And one of the reasons that happened is because you had such a great buildup of education and social capital. Families were in great shape. Employment was in great shape, comparable with the white community. And so when that wave hit in the 50s, right, of economic growth, Black people were able to ride that wave right out of poverty.
It's awesome.
But immediately in the 60s, they get hit with, sometimes I use the phrase, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 punch, because you've got stuff like the welfare state, which has the really perverse incentives with regard to marriage and work.
Single family households, right?
Yeah, and even just work. I mean, my friend Craig Richardson, who studies social mobility, he says there's not a welfare cliff, there's a welfare desert. I mean, it is really hard to jump from welfare to work the way that we have it set up. And so both work and family deeply undermined. Conservatives talk about that, but then others talk about things like the legacy of redlining in housing. We talk about the way that the highways were built and knocked through all of these great economic centers. The program of urban renewal, where, you know, high density housing was just mowed down and replaced with low density housing. People were scattered. Their neighborhoods were scattered and ruined. And that's not just Black people, also Latinos, immigrant communities, right? Other communities that were mobile. They were working class, but they were upwardly mobile. And what we did is we undermined the progress that they were making by undermining all of that social capital with all of those different programs, not just welfare, right? But those other things as well, which were big federal programs spending millions and hundreds of millions of dollars to socially engineer people from above, right? So this wasn't a spontaneous order, so to speak, right? It wasn't the market at work. It was the federal government at work thinking they knew best how to move us around like little chess pieces on a board. And sure enough, all of that progress really was rolled back. I shouldn't say all, right? But much of it was rolled back in a way that was very damaging to the Black community. Now, I always want to say 80% of Black people are not poor, right? We have a lot, the majority of Black people are middle class. We have a lot of progress that has been made. But in terms of being overrepresented under the poverty line, a lot of that can be explained through those 1960s programs. They were very destructive.
Yeah, and that's one of the things we try to emphasize to our friends on the left, you know, is that a lot of the worst and the most pervasive segregation that existed in the United States is a product of, as Rachel said, right, the highway systems running through really opulent Black communities, explicitly by local planners. They run them through these areas. There were other alternatives. They ran them through these areas purposefully, oftentimes racially motivated. But it's not just the highways. It's also, if you take a look at sort of the New Deal, if you go back even earlier, right, you look at sort of the Federal Housing Association, right, you look at sort of redlining, other things like that. This is systematic. And if you look at the FHA manual, they explicitly said their goal was to create homogenous neighborhoods. And if you read between the lines, which you don't really have to if you go back to the 1938 manual, it says explicitly what that is. And that is they want to encourage white home ownership, right? And white communities. And so places like Oakland that were not segregated by Jim Crow get segregated because of this New Deal program that may have been beneficial to poor whites, but actually is extraordinarily harmful to Black Americans who should have been able to get home loans, but were not able to get home loans because the FHA would not insure those loans, right? And so as a result, banks oftentimes wouldn't take risks. And sometimes when banks were willing to take risks, they were still shot down by the FHA. And so we detail that history in the book as well. But time and time again, whether it's the Great Society or whether it's the FHA or whether it's the highway system, it's government getting in the way of people who are trying to lift themselves up out of poverty and to do better for themselves. And, you know, it's funny, you watch the sort of Hulu documentary on the 1619 Project on how capitalism created all these problems for America. When you watch that documentary, Nicole Hannah-Jones is actually pointing to a ton of government programs. And I just want to tweet her and say, like, you are proving our point. All right. This is not capitalism. This is not free enterprise that caused this. It's intervention into the marketplace, stopping people from being creative.
So does it begin, like you said, in the middle of the 60s? I believe the 60s are the most instrumental time period into changing America as we know it. Obviously, with the assassination of JFK, right afterwards, you get into the Vietnam War. You have the gold standard being completely removed in the early 70s. You have the birth control pill being implemented everywhere, right? So good or bad, it changes the world. But you also have government involvement. You have printing of insane amounts of money. And you have all of these seemingly great things like the voting rights and whatnot, but also LBJ, I think that's what you're alluding to, having all of this government involvement within the home and incentivizing people the wrong way. So where does it really begin? What administration, or is there a single point in history where you could say, yep, this is it?
I think that if we were asked for where did the turn come, I think I as a historian would like to go back to the 30s and talk about the Roosevelt administration and the FHA and the New Deal. The AAA also harmed Black Americans because a disproportionate number of them were sharecroppers. Social Security wasn't extended to domestic workers. There's a whole array of the GI Bill after the war. But I would go back to the 30s. But I think that you're right that the 60s are a pivotal point, and we talk about this in the book. So Rachel, I don't know if you want to expand upon that. I would take it back to the 30s, where the growth of government begins to really get out of control, but it really, really sort of coalesces in the Great Society programs that Lyndon Johnson puts together, because he sees himself as wanting to rival FDR in terms of the amount of legislation that he passes. And it was really, really detrimental to Black Americans, I think. Rachel?
As a philosopher, I would take it back even further because I think the 60s are the fruit of a bad tree. It's bad from a bad tree. And the bad tree is capital P progressivism. So we have a little section on Woodrow Wilson. And the whole idea is that you have the rise of a mindset. It's a mindset. Adam Smith called it the man of system. The progressives are saying life is complicated in the modern world. We need experts to be telling us how to live.
Wow.
And a great example of this is the eugenics movement, right? The idea that the zenith of science is us running evolution and deciding who lives and who dies, right? Who gets to reproduce and who doesn't.
Wow.
And so all of this other stuff is coming out of that terrible mindset that doesn't understand human nature, doesn't understand spontaneous order, doesn't understand how complex economies work.
Wow, you bring up a very good point. Planned Parenthood probably started, what was that, 20s or 30s? And so is that what you're talking about? That was the birth child of this eugenics movement. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, we have a letter that we reference in the book between John Maynard Keynes and Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood. And he says, now that we've solved the quantity problem, we need to start working on the quality problem. And he's talking about people, human beings.
Yeah, right? And John Maynard Keynes is
this was the zenith of science.
Yeah. Sorry, Rachel, I didn't mean to interrupt you there. John Maynard Keynes is, of course, the father of Keynesian economics, right? The general theory of money and value, whatever. Sort of very much sort of this type of interventionist idea in terms of the economy, right? Government needs to come in and intervene. But what Rachel's talking about, is in the around 1900 or so, like if you went to college, scientific racism was dominant in the United States. And if you look at the founding of the sort of American Economic Association, right, many of the founders of that are eugenicists. And the minimum wage, right, Rachel, has this sort of eugenicist sort of origin that you can expand upon.
Yeah, no, I mean, Kellogg, a lot of these major thinkers, there were people on presidential cabinets, all over the developing world. People were interested in eugenics, and one of the ways they were going to do it is by disemploying non-white male heads of household, or people, anyone who wasn't a male head of household, right? A non-white, disabled, any other group. And the way we were going to disemploy them is by requiring such a high minimum wage that no one would hire them. And that was, I'm saying explicit. We're not reading between the lines. They came right out and said it in famous economic textbooks.
Yeah.
And
what year is this?
I've got to remember
early
the exact
20s,
name.
right?
Early that 20s, is interesting. 18s. I've never heard that. That is unbelievable. I got to look that up. That's fascinating.
It's nuts. And the book you may want to look at besides ours is Illiberal Reformers by Thomas C. Leonard, where he goes through all of this. And we depend on him heavily in that section. And our point in bringing up eugenics and the minimum wage, right? And the way that people were forcefully sterilized and all of these just terribly illiberal ideas is that it's all from this same mindset. The experts know best, and they can decide how society is going to turn out and come up with policies to determine a certain social outcome. And when you have thinkers, wonderful classical liberal thinkers like F.A. Hayek, right, Friedrich Hayek, what is he saying? He's saying, and this is his point about social justice, you can't do that. You can't figure out how to make a certain social outcome happen in a highly complex, pluralistic society. That's not how it works. Individuals, families, and small groups make plans. And then there is a spontaneous order because you have a good infrastructure of law. And then you get whatever outcome you get. And you can't actually control that. Right. And it's like really important to see that. And luckily, you usually get really good outcomes because people actually know how to run their own lives. They actually know. They have local knowledge. They know their families. They know their neighborhoods. They know their skills. They know what to produce, et cetera, et cetera. The entrepreneur can see the gap in the market. Trust them. Give them the freedom to do it, and you will get an amazing flourishing economy. But try and control it, and you'll undermine yourself. And that's the ultimate sort of classical liberal vision.
So you touched on welfare and how difficult it is to escape that world. I worked in a swimming pool business. And at the end of the year, that obviously it's the winter time and there's no work. So people go on unemployment. And I saw how difficult it was for people to escape that cycle simply because and that's unemployment, which is actually paid by the employer, not the government. But then I started doing research on welfare and I realized there are certain things you can and can't do when you're on welfare. And that means you can't start your own business. The moment you start to say you're out there trying to make your life better, you could get removed from that welfare, which keeps people on that payroll, if you will. And one thing that really shocked me whenever I was dead broke starting a business was I got hit with the Obama, the healthcare. I didn't have money to afford healthcare when I was first starting out, I believe 2011. And I was as an entrepreneur, as what was the individual mandate, I think that's what it was. And
yeah.
I would get fined at the end of the year because I didn't pay for health insurance. Now I could have, and my accountant said this, you could give up your entrepreneurial dreams and you could take welfare and you can get this free healthcare, or you can continue to pursue this entrepreneurial dream and get hit with this fine. So I was being penalized for pursuing what I called greatness. And that is insane. So the difficulty of escaping welfare is very prevalent. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so economists have really good, helpful concepts for this. So one is the concept of a perverse incentive. And they also use the term moral hazard. So a certain policy can have a moral hazard because it actually creates perverse incentives. It creates incentives that send people in the opposite direction from the one you're actually trying to accomplish in their lives, right? And so you think, oh, well, if I want to help people, I'll give them money. I mean, it seems so logical.
Mm-hmm.
And yet what happens is people become dependent on that, and then they aren't able to achieve their goals. Now, that may be part of the way we structure it, right? And so maybe we could argue that there's a way to create better incentives within the system. And then some argue there's no way, it's just a trap, right? And so I think that's an interesting debate that reasonable people can have, but there is simply no denying that the system that we currently have is an absolute mess of perverse incentives and moral hazards that makes it truly irrational to go off of the system and switch over to work just because of the way that you lose your benefits.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, it's literally for that person in that moment, particularly if they have a short-term time preference. And here's the thing, poor people often do have a short-term time preference. In other words, they tend to think in the short term. And I'll tell you why. I work with a ministry here in St. Louis that works on Enright Boulevard, very tough area. And, these young guys, you know what they say? They say, I hope I make it to 21. I hope I make it to 21 years old. It's awful, despairing way of life. But the truth is, there's a lot of truth to that in their lives. So they're not going to be thinking what's going to happen in 20 years because they don't even know if they're going to make it that long. So if we set up the short-term incentives such that people have absolutely no reason to be switching away from the system onto work, then we have trapped them forever. And now what happens? They're more likely to be in a situation where they're dead by 21. And so we've actually created the opposite. So F.A. Hayek uses the term unintended consequences. And we do this over and over and over again with our policies. Rent control. I could give you a million examples. Minimum wage, disemployment through minimum wage, right? It's over and over. We do something we think we're helping and we're hurting. We're actually hurting.
In the 1990s, Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton, right, they tried to address this problem with welfare in their welfare reform package, and they added work requirements to welfare. My understanding is that had a tremendous effect upon getting people transitioned off of welfare and back into the workforce. And I'm a historian, so we're getting a little bit, once we get into like the 2010s, I'm like, well, okay, this is current events. But, my understanding is that President Obama weakened some of those requirements during his administration. And I'm not sure what's happened to them over the course of the last 10 years or so, but doing research in the 90s, welfare reform seemed to have worked pretty well in terms of like transitioning at least a large number of people into work and getting them off of that pathway to dependency. And so I think if you're looking for a model that could work today, we might revisit that moment in history where right and left came together to actually try to accomplish something that you could still benefit or help people, right, as they help themselves out of these precarious sort of positions. But yeah, go ahead, Rachel. Sorry.
I was just going to say, my understanding is that a lot of that eventually shifted over to disability. And so disability has become the new welfare in a sense. And because it's too easy to qualify for, it's just sort of replaced. So much of the progress that we made in the 90s in terms of welfare reform, we lost because of the disability program.
Yeah, I just want to say one last thing, Mike, on this point is that these moral hazards that Rachel's talking about, I mean, we see them all around us, not just in welfare, but also in terms of like, if you think about the financial crisis in 2008, right? We were trying to do something really helpful by giving everybody a home, right? We're going to have Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, we're going to have low interest loans, and we're going to get these people into homes. And then when the market fell out, what happened to all those folks? They lost their homes, right? They ended up in a much worse place than they otherwise would have been. But that policy that, sort of subsidizing the loans in that way created a moral hazard where banks made extraordinarily risky loans, right, to people. And in the long run, it actually harmed those people that people like George W. Bush and, President, wanted to help along the way. And of course, that's led to sort of, we're talking about what's kept people from actually advancing. I think that, those types of moral hazards and bad policies have played a role as well.
Since putting out the book, what has been the response? And my only assumption is that it's very much like Plato's Allegory of the Cave. I always talk about this book. Have you ever read this book at all?
Yeah, I'm a philosophy professor.
Oh, very much. All right. So whenever you wake up and you see what's out there, and then you go and take these solutions back to someone who is basically in the cave, they are going to hate you for it, because what you're really doing is shining a light on, hey, it's time for you to take back the power, and you have the ability to do that. And if you don't do it, it's on you. So has it been a very warm reception? Have people fought you in this? You have 44 strong reviews on Amazon. So what have you guys seen?
Yeah, surprisingly, I think the reception has been overwhelmingly positive. I will say that, we wrote the book primarily for Black Americans and for conservatives, which may seem like two weird groups of people to write a book for, but those were our target audiences. We wanted to offer Black Americans an alternative history that challenged sort of the perception that the left puts out about sort of, Black achievement, a narrative that talks about how Black Americans had agency and were empowered and empowered themselves, and then conservatives. And so I would say most of my speaking has been to conservative audiences, and those audiences have actually received the book very, very, very positively, and have had really constructive conversations about the places where I think conservatives are a little blind, which is to acknowledging past injustice. We wanted to challenge conservatives on that front. And from what I've seen from my, being, sort of giving talks around the country, conservatives have been very responsive to talking about these issues and to acknowledging sort of past injustices in a way that I think can be quite constructive. And so I would say from conservatives and from the center, it's been really positive. Rachel, can you speak to progressives?
Yeah, let me just back up that point first, and then I'll talk about progressives. I would say, here's how the book works and why it's gotten such a good reception, in spite of, I know, the phenomenon you're talking about, Mike, which is, coming out into the light of day from the cave and feeling blind and upset.
Right.
Blinded by the light, so to speak. But I think here's why it's been so positive. African Americans as a group in the United States are actually fairly socially conservative. They tend to be highly religious, for instance, and pretty entrepreneurial. They're not socialists. I mean, we certainly saw that with the rejection of Bernie Sanders in the South. And so the most centrist, of Democratic voters, the further far left you get, the more white and rich you are.
Yeah. Isn't that crazy? Yeah.
Yeah, statistically speaking, Latinos and Blacks are the most centrist Democratic voters. Anyway, and so I think what was nice for them is to actually see, hey, I actually believe in all this stuff: private property rights, contract rights, equal protection of the rule of law, pro-constitutionalism, Martin Luther King Jr. You know what I mean? Like, these are actually my values. I'm not on the far left. I'm not part of the squad. But this is the first book that affirms those things and also tells the truth about our history and the nasty violations of those things that were done specifically to Black Americans. And so we really spend a lot of time telling the truth, the ugly truth of, convict leasing program and lynchings and massacres and so forth, because we want to show, here's what happens when you don't have the equal protection of the rule of law. Here's what happens when you violate people's private property rights. This is why this stuff is sacred, right? And so they're feeling good because their history is being affirmed, and so are their values. Then flip it to conservatives, a lot of white conservatives, and they're feeling good because they're being asked to talk about this difficult history, but not in a way that's asking them to jettison everything they know about the goodness of the Constitution, the goodness of the American project, and the goodness of free markets. And so they're like, hey, wait a second. I can actually talk very intelligently and graciously about this terrible history of oppression without giving up any of the things that I know and value about our way of life here in the United States. And so I think that's part of the reason we've gotten such a good response, is because nobody was really putting those two things together before. And so I think that's valuable. Progressives, I have to tell you, I've convinced some people on a few things. I've been amazed, nice. Minimum wage here and there, a couple of aha moments. But I feel that progressives are sort of addicted to central planning. And so there's this mindset, it goes back to that man of system, chess piece mindset, where they just think that there's some mixture of policies that's going to be like a button we can push. and we're going to solve our problems, because it's always top down in their minds. And so it's almost like breaking people of an addiction. They have to flip over to that spontaneous order mindset. And that's a big transition. It's almost a paradigm shift.
Man, that's a great way to put it. We've worked with many people when it comes to their books. And when I think of my conservative clients that were Black, I look at them and they all agree that, the government caused a lot of problems. And I look at some of the people who are on the left that were my clients, and they were Black, and they what they said is, if the government was the problem, both of these groups of people believe it. The difference is who has the solution. And the people on the left always said, well, the government has caused the problem, but they have the solution. Like you said, it's a top-down philosophy. But the conservatives believe, well, they caused the problem, therefore they don't have the solution. Let me take life, back my life, and take control, and maybe create multiple revenue streams, break these patterns, read these books, go to these seminars, get around these people. And I see a very big difference in where they go from there. So I did notice, and maybe you're touching on this too, 2020, things changed, maybe 2016 even, you could say. I believe it's starting to shift. Are you noticing the same thing? There is a liberation that's happening mentally, more so now than ever before.
Yeah, so I did write an article. You can read it on my blog, rachelfergusononline.com, on racial shifts in voting. There's a tendency among minority groups to vote together, to vote as a group. And you can understand that in a way, because there's a sense of, we're so small anyway. If we get split up, we'll have no voice at all. And that's called linked fate. And so it's hard for people to break away in a different way than it would be for the majority group that's just like, oh, this is just my individual opinion, And so it takes a lot to get to the point where a subgroup within a minority will break off and vote differently. But we have actually seen one of the most significant shifts in the Black male vote that happened in 2020. I think it was something like 4%, but that's huge in that community.
Yeah.
Huge. And then the Latino community, it was 10%. So Latino is now at 60-40, which is a much more healthy kind of, conversation going on within that community. And I think as time goes on, there's more of a sense of, the Democrats say a lot to us and they talk about us, but what have they really done for us?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
But I do want to say to the Republicans, because, as a classical liberal, I'm not a party person at all, and neither is Marcus. I really want to come down on the Republicans here and say, hey guys, you could do a heck of a lot better of a job of reaching out to these communities without just crapping on them all the time, frankly. And you can see this. I hope I'm not offending anyone when I say this, but there's been a big dust up with Candace Owens in the last week. And the truth is that a lot of Black conservatives have been talking about this with her and figures like her for years, which is, it's great to be a conservative, but don't just tell us what's wrong with us. Tell us what we have as a legacy in Black America that we can draw upon to succeed, right? And so it's not just about look at your communities and how broken they are. It's, hey, look at your tradition. You actually have Black church. You have the National Negro Business League. You have Fraternal Society, right? You have this whole history and legacy of great stuff. Let's get back to that and really succeed and move up. And instead, you hear so much negativity, I think, from the right towards these minority groups that you end up, it's not very attractive. And so I think that as we see those shifts, we need to lean into that and start having a much better kind of language and tone towards these groups. And the number one way you can do that is by reading our book.
There you go.
We will help you.
That's a good plug, Rachel. Yeah, I just want to say briefly, Mike, that Black voters have been aware that national Democratic candidates say one thing on the campaign trail and do another thing once they're in office since at least the 1976 election. I'm writing a book right now about Jimmy Carter's Southern strategy and the ways in which he tried to appeal to Black voters, and they're very aware of this. And I think the reality is they just never really have seen the Republican Party as an alternative, at least since sort of the 1970s, late 1960s, early 1970s, was sort of the law and order rhetoric. Nixon and others. And so we've seen attempts by people like Jack Kemp in the 1990s to really try and go after Black voters and appeal to them. But I think Black voters are open. I think they're there for the taking if the Republican Party can do a good job, as Rachel said, right, of appealing to them and sort of reaching out to them and recognizing that there are these common values that Black Americans and conservatives have. They just need to be emphasized more.
So what would be your solution? I'm sure it's in the book, but is it a much greater push for entrepreneurship or self-reliance or financial independence or stronger community? Like you said, I mean, relying on the community rather than government, that to me is a very healthy approach. So what do you propose as the next step? If someone's listening to this right now, what is the solution?
Yeah, so I, Rachel will have her response, and she'll talk about community here in just a moment. But I'm a huge proponent of educational freedom. I think that you have got to call your congressman, you have got your state congressman, your state senator, and you have got to fight for school choice in your state.
Yeah.
You have got to break out of people being sent to schools based upon their zip codes. That is the legacy of the highway system. That is the legacy of zoning. That's the legacy of discrimination. And so we've got to empower parents, Black, white, Latino, to be able to take their kids to schools, the schools that they want to take their kids to. And so I think educational freedom is extraordinarily important. To get back to your first question, right? Education is so important. And so many minority kids are trapped in failing schools. And the Democratic Party just continues to double down on more spending. No, we have a broken system, right? And incorporating vouchers will encourage people. It will basically create incentives, right, for schools to respond to parents and their needs and their desires. And it should lead to more choices of education and better, right, schools as well. So hopefully, so for me, it's all about educational freedom. I think that's a really important issue, as Glenn Youngkin, I think, has shown in Virginia, right? It crosses across sort of ethnic and racial lines. And it's really empowering. And as we said, families and education, if we want to build the foundation for the future.
Yeah. We also talk in the book about economic freedom, and it can be things as simple as removing barriers, this occupational licensing reform, no, you don't need to have a high school diploma to be a barber. You don't need to have some kind of special training to put flowers together. I mean, come on, this is just established businesses trying to keep newcomers out. That's cronyism. It's as old as time, but we have to stand up against it because we need the people who are at the bottom, on the bottom rung of the economy, to be able to start climbing. And so we have to remove those barriers wherever we can. That's economic freedom. We do talk about criminal justice reform. And in this realm, there's a lot of ideas, but I think the point is that there's actually a ton of really reasonable criminal justice reform that's actually pro-police in the sense of getting rid of, police who give the others a bad name, right? And so in many ways, it's supportive of the police. It's anti-over-criminalization, which causes the police to have to do more than they should have to do, and have too much negative contact with the community and things like that. And so it's not divisive. Right. And what we saw is that actually a lot of conservative states, Oklahoma, Georgia, Texas, they were doing Kansas, they were doing the most interesting stuff in the area of criminal justice reform. They were reducing their prison population, etc. And then here comes this crazy rhetoric from the left, prison abolition and all, it's like, come on, you guys, nobody in a tough community wants that, right? Nobody in a tough community wants fewer police. That's ridiculous. They may want to be treated better by police, but they know that they need police, And so striking that balance and saying, hey, there's actually very reasonable things we can do in this area without falling off, the edge of a cliff. And then finally, one of the solutions we talk about is neighborhood stabilization. And that's really questioning the way we do charity and the way we do philanthropy. And it's perfect for you, Mike, because you're obviously into financial independence, right? And people becoming entrepreneurs. And what we've done is we've imitated the state when it comes to the way that we do our philanthropy. And so we're putting people through soup kitchens. We're handing them turkeys and backpacks, which just makes them dependent on us. Right. And so we're the wonderful middle class people, right, who stand above you and hand you what you need. And instead, we're not empowering them. And so when you look at neighborhood stabilization, it's much more holistic. It's about surrounding people, knowing them personally, being with them, walking through life with them so that they can become independent and actually emerge from poverty, right? And so we have to criticize not just the government, but ourselves when it comes to the way that we handle poverty alleviation.
Yeah,
Yeah,
can I say one more thing, Mike?
yeah,
Sorry to
absolutely.
cut you off.
Go
The other thing that like I've become extraordinarily passionate about over the last 9 months since we finished the book is zoning reform. And this has to be done at the local level, right? But we have to build more high density housing. We have to make it easier for people to build housing, right? So I talk to so many people in cities and they're like, I can't afford a home, etc. I have no doubt that if you ease the zoning regulations, right, entrepreneurs would pour into these places and build homes and apartments and condos, etc. But the reality is that NIMBYs, not in my backyard, right? People who own homes like myself, right? They're worried about their home values, so they go to their local, city council, and they basically shut down new projects by sort of lobbying their local, city council to not approve apartment complexes and other things like that. And we have a housing crisis across the country. It hasn't reached the South quite yet, but as more and more people move into places like Texas, it will come to the South as well. And the only way to combat that is on the sort of local level, once again, by pushing back against these progressive era zoning laws that really restrict entrepreneurs from building housing that allows families, right, to have a place to live and to ultimately become upwardly mobile.
Yeah, amen to that too.
Excellent. You brought up school choice. I believe the government should stay far away from the school system. And I've been to some schools where they're given certain books, and I've been to the wealthiest households with they're being homeschooled and they're given a certain book or a certain set of information, and it is 180 degrees difference. And that is very, very alarming because what they're given in school is not good for them, the way I look at it. And I'm a big Dr. Jordan Peterson fan. You guys, are you a fan of his stuff?
Yeah, I like Jordan Peterson.
He always says that if you want to become dangerous, you have to learn to read and write. And writing is the deepest level of thought. So I think there should be such a heavy focus on that. It's not what to think, it's how to think. And writing does that. And whenever it comes to last two questions, when it comes to literacy, I believe it's dropping like crazy, especially in certain communities. Are you noticing anything like that? Now, you said you're more of a historian, so it might be more of a current event affair, but is that common? I've seen in Georgia, I think there's, whenever you have Bush getting with the no child left behind, right?
Yeah.
It sounds very good, right? But the moment that happens, there's no incentive to learn to read and write and become better and progress with your skills. So I see all of that. Are you noticing anything along those lines?
Well, yeah, I mean, as a historian, right, you're absolutely right. But as an educator, I can speak anecdotally about what I've seen in the classroom. And I love my students. My students are great. But I do think that the writing has declined over the course of the 10 years that I've been teaching at the college level. And I just don't think they're coming in prepared. And I think it's gotten a lot worse since 2020, obviously shutting down schools during the pandemic. I know there was, we have a long conversation about what we knew at the time and what the proper policy positions were. But what we ultimately did, where we closed down schools, we deprived, 2 or 3 years worth of students of the skills necessary to perform at the college level. And so we've had to do a lot of hard work, or at least that's what I've seen over the course of the last 3 or 4 years, to try and get those students to where they need to be in terms of writing. And so just anecdotally, I 100% agree with that. I imagine, based upon my conversations with older colleagues, that it's a much longer trend, as you said, since sort of the George W. Bush years or even before.
So we always ask this when it comes to our guests, the one question outside of your own book, is there a book that you recommend to our listeners, or maybe a book that changed your life or put you on this path that you're on right now?
Well, one of the things we do in our book is recommend a lot of books.
Oh, good. Okay. Good deal.
No, I mean, truly. And we're admitting in our book that we're drawing heavily upon other scholars. So if you're interested, for instance, in some of this housing history, there's the Richard Rothstein book, The Color of Law, has become an almost classic. Marcus's work point about zoning. There's Nolan Gray's Arbitrary Lines, right? The one, illiberal reformers, right?
Yeah, I wrote that down. Liberal reformers. Got it.
Right. And so really in each chapter, we're talking about, major works that may be interesting to you, depending on what part of the history you really like to get into. I mean, if you want to go all the way back in Black history and look at, post-emancipation, post-Reconstruction prior to 1910, there's a really great book called Competition and Coercion by the amazing libertarian author, Robert Higgs. Who he gets down into the data and he shows all of this ways that, the freedom of movement allowed Black people to pit their employers against each other and raise their sharecropping percentages and things like that, even at a time when they didn't have a lot of other rights, but they did have the right to move. They did have the right to leave. And that meant a lot, and so the whole book is just full of other book recommendations that I'd point you to.
If I could recommend your listeners read one thing today, you can read it over coffee. It'll take you 15, 20 minutes, maybe a little bit more, maybe 30 minutes during your sort of coffee break or lunch break. I highly recommend F.A. Hayek's The Use of Knowledge in Society. It's the most important, I think it's the most important critique of central planning in the 20th century. I mean, it's a product of a long history of debates, but it's a very short piece. And what it gets at is sort of the idea that the central planners don't have the necessary knowledge to make these types of decisions. And that's why they fail. It's not that they have bad intentions. It's that they don't have the knowledge necessary to actually be able to solve these types of problems. So I would recommend The Use of Knowledge in Society. It's a very short article. You can find a PDF of it online. And then a book that changed my life was Capitalism and Freedom by Milton Friedman. Friedman and Hayek continue to be
incredible economists.
Yeah.
Where is his knowledge out in society nowadays, man? Milton Friedman. Wow. Yes.
So I would recommend that.
The young people don't know his name.
They don't know his name. Whenever I saw him do a speech about what actually is inflation, I'm like, if that's inflation, what the heck? Why are they keep printing money? Right? He's the only one that put inflation in simple terms. It's a drink of alcohol, I think is the way he put it.
Yeah,
and it feels great for a day or a couple hours, but the next day you have the hangover, and that's where the pain sets in. And that to me was the greatest definition of inflation and printing money. Phenomenal. Great recommendation there, Marcus.
I'll jump in with one last one, Mike, if you're interested in neighborhood stabilization. And this is a little self-promoting too, but the organization I work with in St. Louis is run by an incredible guy named Lucas Rugley. And he just wrote a book called When the Sirens Stop, all about his experiences moving into a really rough neighborhood and working with his neighbors and seeing the transformations that occurred. It's very, very inspiring. And it'll give you a sense of that kind of holistic sort of philanthropy that we need to move over to.
Awesome. Best way to get a hold of you guys is social media. Do you have a website you recommend?
I'm at Liberty Ethics on Twitter, and my website is rachelfergusononline.com. And I post articles, book reviews, podcasts that I'm on, always there. So you can take your pick.
I am at Marcus Witcher on X, the social media platform.
Oh, that's right.
Not Twitter.
And you can get in touch with me on X.
Beautiful. Guys, this has been very interesting. I have not had a guest that had this much information on this topic. So thank you so much for providing this to our listeners. And guys, the book is called, we pull it up again on Amazon, Black Liberation Through the Marketplace, Hope, Heartbreak, and the Promise of America. Pick it up today, check it out, and you will become set free. So $1 million book will lead to $1 million life. Right on.